right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Britt, and I'm an aquarist here at the Virginia Living Museum, and I'd like to welcome you to another Facebook Live session with us. Today we're going to be feeding some of the animals in our touch tank exhibit. We know a lot of you guys may have tuned into our previous touch tank feeding, but we know a lot of you are also missing our touch tank and getting to see some of these animals, so we decided we'll do another round of it. So the first animals that I'm going to be feeding in this tank are actually the fish. So most of the time people don't get to see the fish eat in this tank, but I've got a little bit of enrichment for them. So I have this little wiffle ball right here, and it's just an ordinary wiffle ball you'd play with in gym class or at the beach or whatever. And it's got a little extra hole cut in it, and it's filled with mysis. It's very hard to see since it is inside the ball already, but there are some very, very small mysis shrimp in here for them. So I'm going to toss it in for the fish, and they are familiar with this, so they're gonna go after it right away. And they love this little thing, and it's just something that's kind of a more exciting way for them to eat. It makes them work for their food just a little bit, and sometimes they get it stuck over there like they did today. And these fish, they're actually adapted to live in pretty shallow water, so you don't have to worry about them being that close to the surface or in such shallow areas, because they are very used to that. And these fish are called sheep's head minnows. We also have some mummichogs in here, but they are not typically the fish that'll interact with this particular item. But these ones, you can all see they're very chunky, they're pretty well fed, so they don't need too much food, so I only put a little bit of food in there today. And the sheep's head minnow is a very cool fish because they can live in a wide range of salinities and temperatures. They're very adaptive, very hardy fish. And the males get very beautiful during breeding season. So the males will get this glittery blue coloration on top of their foreheads and their fins, and they'll sometimes flash little bits of oranges. They're really, really pretty fish. So right now they're so focused on the food that none of the males are displaying their breeding colors, but hopefully by the time you guys get back in, you'll be able to see a little bit of that as well. All right, so I'm going to swing around here, and hi everybody. So I'm going to move this a little bit out of the way so that they aren't completely in our way as we're looking at the rest of this feeding. And they've gotten most of the food out, so they may not be as interested in it anymore. So other animals that we have in this tank are many types of crabs. We also have some whelks. We've got a lot of clams today, which I'll actually show you a little bit of because it's not something we typically show our guests too much. And then we've got our horseshoe crabs, which are the ones that I'm actually going to be feeding for the rest of this feeding. So over here you can see both a horseshoe crab, which is this one right here, the big guy, shaped a lot like a horseshoe, and then a spider crab right next to him, who's just been climbing on this wall for quite a while. And he's kind of coming down because he sees other animals eating and he thinks there's going to be some food for him. But he might get lucky, he might get a piece later. So I'm going to take one of these horseshoe crabs out and teach you a little bit about them. So this here, like I said, is a horseshoe crab, but the name is actually not very accurate. To call it a crab is a little bit interesting, and I'll tell you why in a second. It looks like we have a question.
Do they shed their shells?
Yes, they do. Yeah. So these, I was about to say like other crustaceans, but they're not actually a crustacean. These, like many other invertebrates in general, they do shed their exoskeleton, and then a larger crab will emerge from it. And they'll actually emerge about 30% larger than this. So imagine this, but an extra third. So you'd be pretty big after this molt. So this horseshoe crab, like I said, is not actually a crab. It is a lot more closely related to arachnids, like spiders and scorpions and ticks and stuff like that. But they do live in the water, so there are several species of arachnids that can survive in the water. So you can see his very smooth round face right here. That's great for kind of shoveling through the sand, because a lot of the times you will find them buried in the sand. And he's got several eyes. He has two compound eyes right here, which see a lot like a bug's eyes do. And then he has about 7 other secondary eyes that are much simpler. They're a lot more like photoreceptors in that they only detect light. They don't necessarily detect pictures like the compound eyes might. And there are some right there. You can see 2 teeny little eyes on either side of that bump there. They've also got some along the sides of their shell, and even some on their tail, which I don't really think are too visible. And they've also got one pair down here underneath them next to their mouth. And I don't know where the eyes are. They're very hard to see, but they do have some eyes there too.
Zoe, age 9, would like to know, how long do they live?
How long do these guys live? That's a very, very good question. It's not actually known how long these guys can live. They can live at least 20 years, sometimes up to 40 years, and no one really knows how long they can live, so it could be even longer than that.
Foster, age 5, would like to know, is this a boy or a girl?
That's a good question too. This one is a boy, and you can tell because of these big boxing glove claws here in the front. He keeps trying to push my finger away with his other claws, but this one right here and right here, these are how you tell if it's a male or a female. The males have these big boxing glove claws that they actually use to hook onto the back of a female's shell when they're trying to mate with them. The females don't have that big boxing glove. They only have another pair of claws just like these right here. And these are not pinching me. They aren't sharp. They're just kind of used to pick up things a lot like our fingers are. So they're very, very smooth. They're not really hurtful at all. And then these fins here in the back, this last set of legs, they have these kind of flipper-like wide fingers, and those are used for a lot of walking, digging, as well as a little bit of help while they're swimming. Do you have any other questions about them at the moment?
Trace would like to know, what do they eat?
What do they eat? So I have some food for them today. So in the wild, they eat things like mollusks and worms, sometimes small crustaceans, bits of fish, squid, all that good stuff, as well as a lot of detritus, so anything that a larger predator may have left behind, so small bits of food that have fallen to the floor, stuff like that. They're kind of a little bit like vultures in that they'll eat any dead material that they can find. But in captivity, they're often fed this, which is called gel. And this comes in a powdered form. It's an omnivore diet, so it's got lots of good algae, as well as fish protein and things like that, that is good for a wide range of our animals here, especially our invertebrates. So you can actually see he's prepared to get some food. He knows what's happening. He knows that when we down, he's gonna get a piece of food. So I just put that right in the center of his body, which is actually where his mouth is located. Yes.
We've had a few of the same questions. Do they have babies?
They do have babies.
Do they lay eggs or give live birth?
They lay eggs, sort of. So they spawn. They don't lay eggs like a chicken does. It's a little bit more like a fish. So in the springtime, sometimes along beaches, especially in Delaware, you'll see large amounts of these crabs come to shore and actually do their spawning there. So they'll come up to the surface and mate, and then they'll kind of release their eggs and sperm into the water, and it will just float away, and the babies will grow up on their own. So they don't take care of their young.
Where is the mouth located?
The mouth is right here, where this food is going to disappear into very slowly. You can see it's surrounded by these little bristles, all these little, almost like toothbrushes, and those are basically very, very tiny fingers that they use to kind of grind down and pull the food into their bodies. So their stomach and everything is on the inside there, past that very unusual mouth. It would be a little bit weird to be like us having a mouth right in the middle of our stomach, which I don't think I would like that much at all. And you can see back here as well, these are gills. They're a type of gill called the book gill, and you can see why. They look a lot like the pages of a book, and they actually use those for both breathing and for swimming. You have a question?
What is the use of their spiky tail, Darvish, age 7?
All right, so this right here, their spiky tail is also called a telson, and the telson is not really dangerous. So people often think that they're gonna spike you with it, that they might stab you like a scorpion does, but that's not true. It's actually just one very harmless thing that unless you step directly on it, you're really not gonna get hurt by it at all. It's not even sharp at the end. And that is used both as a rudder while they're swimming and as a tool for them to flip themselves over if they turn upside down and get a little stuck somewhere. So they'll actually push that into the sand and kind of move themselves and flip themselves over. So I'm going to feed another one of these guys right here. This one's a little bit smaller. So male horseshoe crabs don't get quite as large as female horseshoe crabs. The females of this species can get up to about 2 feet long, but the males only get to about 1.5 feet. They're about 30% to 25% smaller. So I'm gonna give this one a little bit of food as well. This is another male, as you can see. All of the large ones we have in here right now are males. And you actually don't know if it's a male or a female until it molts for the last time in its life. So they molt a lot when they're young, and they all look like females when they're young. But as they get older, eventually they'll get to their last molt that they'll have for a very long time. And then when they emerge from that molt, they're gonna have these big boxing glove claws.
Do our horseshoe crabs have names? Eleanor, age 4.
That's a good question, Eleanor. No, they do not. We have quite a few of them, and we don't typically name a lot of our invertebrates, with a couple of exceptions. So if you have a name for them, feel free to put them in the comments down below. I'd love to hear some of your suggestions.
Do they live in any particular habitat?
They do. So they really like inshore areas that can be brackish water or salt water. You're not typically going to find them in fresh water, but they can handle some lower salinities. So you'll find them in a lot of our marshy areas as well. During the winter time, they tend to go a little offshore where the water stays warmer, and they'll kind of go deeper down in the ocean and kind of hang out there for a bit. And then they'll come back up to the beaches in the springtime to spawn.
How long can they be out of the water?
That's a good question. Not super long, but they can stay out of water for quite a while their gills are still damp. So if they dry out completely, that's not very good for them. So you'll see that I am mostly holding them in the water, so there's some water going over their gills. And if they dry out, they don't get any oxygen, since they don't breathe air like we do. They only breathe using their gills, which need to be in contact with water in order for them to breathe. So I don't know how long exactly, but it's probably close to an hour or so, maybe a little bit more, depending on the weather. All right, so before I go and feed the rest of our horseshoe crabs in here, I want to show you a couple other animals. So, like I mentioned before, we have our spider crab, who's still over here. And he's being very feisty. So this one here is a spider crab, and they are a relative of the Japanese king crab. So those really, really big crabs you'll sometimes see on the menu at certain restaurants. They are just a smaller version of those big guys. And they're also called decorator crabs because this coloration up here, it's actually kind of fuzzy. This is algae that this crab has pulled off of the rocks and stuck to its back with using its saliva. So what it does is it'll pick off some algae off of the rocks and rub it against its legs and spit on it. And like the spit acts like a glue, and it glues it to the legs or whatever part of the body the crab wants. And it does this as camouflage, so it can hide from any animals that might try to eat it. Right. And you can see that this one right here, I've been calling it a boy, but it's actually a female. And you can tell because it has a very round belly right here. That's called an apron. And the apron is where she carries her eggs. So the male only has a very thin apron, where she has a very round one. Any questions about the spider crab before we move on?
Do they sting?
They do not sting. No, they can pinch, and when they get to about this size, the pinch can start to hurt. But other than that, they are very harmless. They're not going to be poisonous. They're not going to really try to pinch you unless you do what I did and pick them up. So he did try to pinch me a couple times. But they're not something you really need to worry about. There's nothing dangerous in this tank.
Does a spider crab bite? Ethan, age 7.
They bite their food, but that's about it. They don't really use their mouth as a form of protection, but they do bite their food. So I am actually going to give him a little reward for being so good in my hand, and I'm going to give him that piece of
I
food.
have a very good question from Grant. Can you tell us about the horseshoe crab's unusual blood?
I can. I was going to get to that later, but now is a perfect time for that. So thank you, Grant. The horseshoe crabs have, like she said, very unusual and actually quite amazing blood. So the horseshoe crabs are sometimes caught as bait by fishermen. Some cultures actually eat them, but the main reason that horseshoe crabs are caught by people is that their blood contains a compound that's called LAL, and it's a type of lysate. So if you know a little bit about chemistry, you may know a little more about lysate than I do. But the LAL compound can actually be used by people to detect bacteria and toxins and fungi. So a lot of places will actually, they draw the blood out using a needle from this little hinge right here, and it's relatively harmless for the crab. There are some that don't really make it, but most are released successfully back into the water. And that LAL compound from their blood, they can actually put it on things like drugs or medical tools and surfaces and things like that to actually detect any dangerous substance that might be on that item. And believe it or not, they actually use LAL tests to detect bacteria and stuff up in the International Space Station. So even astronauts use this stuff. So it's very, very cool. They're actually making a synthetic version of it now, which is great because it means they won't have to harvest any more horseshoe crabs in order to get that compound to do that test. All right, so down here we have one of our hermit crabs. This is a striped hermit crab, and you can tell because it's got very stripy legs right there. We also get another kind of hermit crab here called the flat claw hermit crab, which has very big, chunky, flat claws. And you can see he's very used to being handled. He's actually coming out of his shell, trying to flip himself back over. And most of the time in the wild, they wouldn't do this. They would retreat way back into their shell and hide, because the inside that shell there, they have a very squishy, long body, and it's very vulnerable. You can actually sort of see it coming out. I don't know if the lighting's good enough, but you can see kind of a softer body underneath. The front is very protected, but that inner body is very, very soft and very tasty. So I'm gonna put him back in there before he climbs out of my hand. And then we've got a couple of them right here. I pulled some out earlier so I wouldn't have to dig around and find them. But this is a whelk, and this is a lightning whelk. And you can tell because of the way that its shell opens. If it opens on the left side, it's a lightning whelk. And if it opens on the right side, so if all of this right here was on the right side flipped over, that would be a knobbed whelk. And these ones, these are very small. They can get quite large. They can get, we've had ones that have been about this big before, and I believe they can get a little larger. And when they're very small like this, I believe this one is still a male, but as they get bigger, they actually turn into females, because the females need to be much larger and have much more energy and strength to lay their eggs. And their eggs are very, very tiny. They're actually in an egg case. I'll bring over to you guys. So this is a string of whelk egg cases, and in each of these cases there could be 100 little teeny baby whelks. So they lay lots and lots of babies. Most of those babies don't survive to adulthood, which is why they lay so many, because they don't take care of their babies.
Lucas, age 6, would like to know, what is the biggest predator for horseshoe crabs?
What's the biggest predator for horseshoe crabs? That would be us, believe it or not. We are the biggest predator. We are one of their only predators. Not a lot of animals will eat a large, full-size horseshoe crab because they are really difficult to eat. They don't have a lot of soft body in them. They're very hard on the outside. And they've got all those little spikes and stuff, which are used both for protection and for kind of helping them dig in the sand. So they're not very tasty. So we're really the only thing that might potentially eat them. All right, and like I said before, we've got some clams over here. This is the thing I'm gonna end on today since we're running low on time. But if you guys have more questions, please feel free to ask. We can get a few more in during our recording today, and then afterwards I can go through and answer any that you might have on the Facebook post. But you can see in here we've got lots and lots of clams. Normally this tank here has sea stars in it with a couple of clams, but right now we've taken our sea stars off exhibit so that they can be in much colder water. Typically we store our sea stars in a quarantine tank behind the scenes where it's nice and cool because they like that cold temperature, and we have a few out at a time for guests to see. But since we've got no guests, they're all in quarantine. But you can see their food here. We're keeping a little extra storage of their food. And these are just middle neck clams, and you can see the little black thing sticking out of several of them, like where my shadow is right there. There's a couple right there. That's called the siphon, and that is how the clam breathes. So it pulls water in through that siphon and over its gills, and it actually filters out any bit of particulate matter that might be floating around in the water, and it eats that, and then it deposits the leftovers in the sand below it. So they actually filter water that way. All right, do we have any more questions before we wrap it up? All right, well, like I said, feel free to ask any more questions in our comments section down below this video. And other than that, thank you very much for joining the Virginia Living Museum for another Facebook Live session. And you can join us again at 2:30 today when we'll be giving some enrichment to one of our snakes. And hopefully, since it's a nice day out, we'll be doing that outside, so you'll get a little view of our grounds as well. Be sure to visit us virtually with all of our natural education here on Facebook, and also on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and even TikTok these days. There's always complete updated information on our website, which is thevlm.org. That's THEVLM.org. And also, one last thing before we go, please consider donating to our emergency fund to help us continue to provide great care for our animals during this shutdown that we've been having. You can do that by symbolically adopting an animal or making an in-kind donation. There's lots of ways to do that. So again, for more information on that, visit the VLM.org. Thank you guys so much for watching. We hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time.